The coronavirus is spreading around the world, but hospitals are struggling. Some of them can't even get basic supplies like face masks because so much of the global supply is controlled by China. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The CCP virus has killed tens of thousands of people. Folks in a lot of countries, from ordinary citizens to hospital workers, are having a hard time getting medical supplies like ventilators and even basic face masks. Why? Well, a big reason for that is China. Joining me now to talk about this problem is Curtis Ellis. He's the policy director with America First Policies. He was also a senior policy advisor to Trump's presidential campaign in 2016. Thank you for joining me again, Curtis.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, we're doing this interview over Skype because it's really not safe to do it in person right now. And the governor of New York has just ordered everyone has to wear a face mask when they're out in public. So my question is, there's a huge mask shortage going on. Why is that?
This was deliberately engineered by the CCP. The Chinese Communist Party handed down an edict to all state and local and provincial officials in China that they have to fill out in triplicate, quadruplicate, without using carbon paper, various forms before they can export medical equipment, which includes PPE, personal protective equipment, face masks, surgical gowns, ventilators, swabs, things like that. Now, because of decisions made by penny-pinching pharmaceutical companies, global multinational corporations, the production of this equipment was outsourced to China, to mainland China, the People's Republic of China, many years ago, beginning after China's accession to the World Trade Organization, and it's being granted permanent normal trade relations with the United States, that is basically low tariffs. At that point, global corporations closed a lot of their production facilities in the United States and moved them to China, where they could benefit from a regimented labor force that was operating under the command of the Chinese Communist Party and therefore could not ask for higher wages. They were also given hefty incentives by the Chinese Communist Party: free land, free factories, subsidized energy costs, low or no taxation, low tax rates, export subsidies, because the Chinese Communist Party had a deliberate plan to capture critical industries on a global scale so they could essentially corner the world's production in crucial industries and bankrupt any competitors. So beginning in 2001, global corporations made the choice to start locating their production facilities inside the People's Republic of China. And then in the last few months, when the pandemic became clear, when the outbreak of the CCP virus was known to the Chinese Communist Party before it was known to the rest of the world, the Chinese Communist Party deployed its agents around the world, people working through United Front organizations and their cat's paws, began buying on a global scale, buying up face masks, surgical gowns, PPE around the world and shipping it to China, where it was hoarded in China. And now that the virus has spread to other countries, the Chinese Communist Party government is restricting the export of those items. So it's essentially extorting or blackmailing the world, and then it provides what you would call face mask diplomacy, exporting some of these goods or exporting the ventilators to Governor Cuomo in New York in order to extract obsequious thank yous from people who are basically saying thank you for not torturing us any further and giving us a little relief from the virus that you unleashed on us in the first place.
On that point, the world is facing mask shortages now, and China has been sending these masks to other countries, different cities, and they say they're donating it, but oftentimes they're actually making these places buy them. But they're using this as a form of positive propaganda to make it seem like they're saving the world. Do you think that's working?
I do not think it's working. I think people are very, very cognizant of where this virus came from. They know it originated in Wuhan. Thanks to the work that's being done by some of your colleagues, it's become very clear the mounting evidence, or the growing mountain of evidence, really makes you think that this could well have been an accidental release. The same kind of shoddy workmanship we see in Chinese consumer goods, we're seeing in its handling of highly infectious agents such as bat coronaviruses. And this shoddy handling, this incompetent containment of highly infectious agents has unleashed this on the world. People are aware of that. I've seen survey research, various polls that have shown the American people squarely place the blame on China for this pandemic, for their problems. I know that there are many in the corporate media who are parroting the Chinese Communist Party line and trying to shift the blame to President Trump, to anybody but China. And that's why China is doing the things that you say, using this face mask diplomacy, shipping medical goods to score propaganda victories and portray itself as the savior of the world. And while some leaders may buy this, some political leaders and some corporate mouthpieces who have their own agenda, the people know what's what, and they have a lot of common sense, and they know that no matter what they know spin when they see it. And the Chinese communist politicians are acting like politicians everywhere, trying to shift the blame and portray themselves as the savior, but the people aren't buying it. Unfortunately, too many in corporate media in the United States of America and too many Democratic politicians, I'm going to say it, I'm going to place the blame where it is. If the shoe fits, wear it. Too many Democratic politicians have so much hatred for President Trump that they can't see the tree that's right in front of them. They can't see reality. They have a myopic view, and their hatred for President Trump prevents them from placing the blame where it is, and that's with the Chinese Communist Party. But to answer your question, the people see it. The people know who's responsible for this.
Well, I've actually been surprised about how many Democratic, for instance, Democratic governor of California, Gavin Newsom, Cuomo, even Ilhan Omar was actually saying Trump was doing a good job with the coronavirus handling.
Yeah, no, some of them are being honest, and that's good. That's a good thing, and I like to see that. I'm very disappointed when I see news media outlets like the New York Times basically parroting the CCP line that China bought the world time to deal with the pandemic. That's ludicrous, and it's very disappointing to see so much of the world following the Chinese model of locking down people, shutting down entire countries. Sweden hasn't done that. Japan didn't do that. South Korea didn't do that. They managed to survive. But the Chinese model seems to be, and you see people, you hear reporters from the New York Times saying, gee, the Chinese have done such a great job, we should have Chinese doctors come over here and show us how to do it. Well, how about we have Chinese arc welding teams come over here and show us how to weld doors shut on apartment buildings? I mean, it's really kind of silly. Well, silly is really making light of it. It's really disappointing and shocking.
We definitely have documented some of those instances on the show. But so it's definitely clear now that China at the beginning was hoarding medical supplies. But now they're trying to restart their economy, and they have begun with some restrictions exporting them again. But so does that mean the problem is solved? Can we just go back to importing our medical supplies from China?
No, absolutely not. This is a wake-up call to America. For many years, people like myself, people like Donald J. Trump, and many others have been saying it was a dangerous mistake to outsource our industries. A country that does not grow, dig, and manufacture the essential goods is not an independent country. It's dependent, and it's weak, and it will get weaker and poorer. And very few listened to that. That was a That was a minority view, but now it's become the majority view. The Harris poll that is just recently conducted in the last few days asked people a series of questions about the pandemic. And one of the questions said, companies have a number of responses. What do you think of companies that move away from China and move their production back to the United States? 89% of the respondents had felt very positively about that. And that's across the board. Democrats, Republicans, young, old, male, female, black, white. Among young people, 18 to 34 years old, these are people who basically for their whole life, all they've known is everything being made in China. Even they thought it was a great idea. 77% of people in that age group supported the idea of moving away from China and moving back to the United States, the production of goods. They didn't break it out to even saying essential goods like medicines, but we absolutely have to do that. Medicines, face masks, rare earths, these are essential ingredients. Rare earths are chemical elements that are essential ingredients in things like iPhones, alloys that are used in mountain bikes, used in missile guidance systems. China has a global corner on the market. They account for the world's supply of rare earths, processed rare earth elements that are essential to modern industrial technology. We can't allow that to go on. And there's no reason for that to be. There is absolutely no reason for that to be the case.
So how did U.S. companies become so dependent on Chinese manufacturing?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party had a deliberate strategy to make that happen. China tries to portray itself as the workshop of the world. You hear Wall Street financiers, you read writers in publications like Financial Times, The Economist, just up to a few months ago. They glibly and without even thinking twice accepted the idea of China being the workshop of the world. Well, now we see the dangers of that. So on one hand, you had China deliberately using subsidies, using tax breaks. They went, and other devices like that. For example, they went to Foxconn, the contract manufacturer that does a lot of the assembly work for Apple, iPhones, things like that, iPads, different gadgets. And they said that the government in Shenzhen said, we will build you a factory. We will build the factory. Next to the factory will be the dormitories where the workers in the factory will live. We will build that and provide it to you. All you have to do is do your manufacturing here. And this is an example of the type of subsidies, incentives that they offered in order to lure companies to come manufacture, make the products in China. On the other side of the equation, the counterparty to these negotiations were Wall Street financiers who had control over the multinational companies like Apple, like others, other manufacturing entities, who were looking to maximize shareholder value. They were looking for short-term profits, short-term maximization of the stock price. They were looking to cut costs in every way. Now, it wasn't just labor costs that they were cutting. They were also outsourcing a lot of the R&D, a lot of the engineering know-how was being outsourced. It's one thing to say designed in California, manufactured in China. So they had a couple of top-level engineers in California designing the new gadget, the new iPhone, the new app that'll go on the iPhone, et cetera, et cetera. But so far as the engineering know-how of the logistics management to make sure that all the parts arrived on time, the line engineers to keep the assembly lines running, this type of day-to-day constant improvement, constant refinement of engineering, that too was being outsourced to China. When that happens, you really cripple a country's ability to regain that know-how because this is human capital. So on one hand, you had China with a deliberate strategy saying, we will give you cheap stuff, but we will capture the technology and the know-how for manufacturing. On the other side, you had people saying, I just want cheap stuff. So I will get short-term profits, but long-term, I will lose the ability to do that manufacturing. I will lose the know-how, as well as, the bricks and mortar factories and infrastructure. So it was a very dangerous combination. The Chinese have a long-term plan. On the other side, you have very short-term thinking on the part of some executives in this country and on Wall Street, who, by the way, they don't see themselves as American. They see themselves as global corporations. They bought into this whole idea of we're going to have a borderless world, and it's kind of wishful thinking that served them well financially, but we now see the dangers of the whole setup.
So you really put a lot of the blame on Wall Street for being greedy. You sound a little like Bernie Sanders.
There is a definite look. The old maps of left and right don't describe what's happening in the world anymore. We saw in the last election a significant percentage of Bernie Sanders supporters voted for President Trump. President Trump is opposed to the bipartisan establishment that's ruled Washington. We had, when you saw permanent normal trade relations being foisted upon America, being pushed through Congress, it was done by a bipartisan coalition. You had the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is generally considered a Republican-leaning organization, big executives of the giant Fortune 50 multinationals working out of the White House. And who ran the White House at that time? Bill Clinton. You had a bipartisan establishment working to sell out American workers, sell out American business, sell out American values. Very interesting to really go back and review the record there. This was a giant corporate government coalition pushing for permanent normal trade relations with China. Opposed to it, you saw a bipartisan opposition. There were a number of amendments being presented to the bills in the Senate. These amendments were sponsored by people such as, get ready now, Senator Jesse Helms, arch conservative from North Carolina, hated by everybody on the left as a bigot and just every word that they throw at President Trump now. Also, you had Senator Paul Wellstone from Minnesota, a liberal icon. He made Bernie Sanders look like a moderate because Senator Wellstone was very effective. He died in a plane crash, and he was a hero of the left. So you had the most left-wing members of the Senate and the most right-wing members of the Senate united in condemning China for forced abortions, violating labor rights, imprisoning Uyghurs in the northwest of China. This is in the year 2000 this was going on. In 2001 this was going on. They knew about it. And they said, if we let China into the World Trade Organization and open up permanent normal trade relations, we will lose all of our industries to a totalitarian dictatorship on the other side of the world. You had left-right alliance at that time. You have left-right alliance to that today. And it's that actually should be a beacon of hope for everybody, not just for those Pollyannas who want bipartisanship at all costs, but the fact that there is a way through this toxic partisan divide, which is really being perpetrated by the corporate media as a distraction to the fact that people on both sides of the political spectrum know who the real enemy facing mankind is today. It's the Chinese Communist Party.
Now, you've argued in the past that companies that make critical medical supplies should leave China. But how can we ensure that, so how can the U.S. government make sure those companies move back to the U.S. instead of to other low-cost countries like Vietnam?
Right. Well, first of all, we should be aware that I like Vietnam. I mean, they are another communist dictatorship. They don't have quite the hard edge, and they don't have nuclear weapons as communist China has. But they're right next door to China. So I have a feeling that if China sent a message to the Politburo of the Vietnamese Communist Party and said, don't do this, we want you to do this other thing, they would have little choice but to go along. So you're not going to find a lot of security by being dependent on Vietnam. That's a slight bit better than being dependent on China. So we shouldn't fool ourselves that finding just any low-cost country is the way forward. What the United States government can do is, number one, use its purchasing power through the Department of Defense, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Health and Human Services, and then use its purchasing power through any entity that gets a government contract, whether it's a public hospital somewhere or a company or an outfit that's being supported with subsidies through Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, that those dollars have to be spent on an American-produced product. When the Department of Defense buys antibiotics, buys antidotes to nerve gas agents, buys N95 masks or surgical gowns, those have to be made in the United States, period, full stop. That's the way it used to work. That's the way we've done it before. Do that again. Second, we have to streamline these government regulations. There's currently a thicket of government regulations that are outdated and work as a disincentive to produce in the United States. And third, there are advanced manufacturing techniques that can be expedited, accelerated, and we want those in the United States. We don't want those in low-cost countries. We want that here. We want advanced manufacturing here. When you start factoring in the costs of transportation, transoceanic transportation, using bunker fuel, bunker oil, which is the transportation fuel used in these giant container cargo ships. It's the dirtiest fuel on Earth. I mean, it's high sulfur. It's garbage. It's the lowest end of the refining cycle. It produces more pollution than 10,000 automobiles. When you start factoring in those costs, and then factor in other externalities, such as the cost of food stamps of unemployed Americans, welfare benefits for unemployed Americans, drug addiction, alcoholism, broken homes, lost tax revenues from Americans who are unemployed and companies that don't exist. Start factoring in those externalities. It's not that much more expensive. It's probably cheaper to be manufacturing goods and employing Americans making these things, especially when you start using these advanced manufacturing techniques, 3D printing, etc., and you streamline the regulations so that there's not a disincentive. And fourth, I would definitely support giving a 100% write-off, tax write-off, R&D write-off, capital expenditure write-off, 100% expensing for all investment in the United States right now. And there's a fifth element that can be used here that can be added in, which would be government financing. Look, if Bank of America and Goldman Sachs and the private equity firms do not want to finance entrepreneurs who are ready to build factories in America because, according to their old way of bookkeeping, it's somehow cheaper or more profitable to manufacture in China or someplace like that, I'd say, well, let's have a little competition in this country, and let's have the government provide financing to competitors, to upstarts, entrepreneurs, people who are ready to invest in America. And let's have the government provide financing to companies that will build here in the United States, and then give those companies 100% write-off for their capital expenditures.
So if U.S. companies start moving out of China, what impact will this have on China's economy?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party understands that the stakes could not be higher. It's in a fight for its very survival. It knows that if companies move out of China, there will be millions of unemployed people in China. The constantly rising standard of living that the Chinese Communist Party has promised its people as part of the deal. Don't question our authority. Let us rule here, and we will give you a constantly rising standard of living. That will be null and void. That will be off. And they will see their grip on power loosen. Who knows? All bets are off. They know that that's what is at stake here, and that's why they're fighting so hard to change the narrative. They want the world to forget, and they want the global corporations to forget how dangerous it is to do business in China. That you've got a government that violated basic standards of human decency and basic standards of public health, and also violated Article 6 of the international health regulations it signed on to with the World Health Organization. Article 6 says signatory countries shall inform the WHO within 24 hours of anything that poses a threat to public health. Well, the Chinese Communist Party knew that they had a big problem in Wuhan. They waited a hell of a lot longer than 24 hours before they told anybody about it.
So, when this is all done and over with and the coronavirus is a memory, what do you think will happen to the global manufacturing and supply chains?
Well, if we are not careful, what China wants to see happen, it wants to have a larger share of the global manufacturing supply chains. That's China's goal. It's to come out of this and be the world's #1 power, economic, manufacturing, and therefore military and diplomatic. That's what it's angling for. That's exactly what it's angling for, and it has said so. We have to be aware of that and counter that. We, meaning the United States of America and the industrial democracies of the West. And if we are, and we do the right thing, provide the incentives, have an industrial policy, we can come out of this stronger ourselves, because there will be the resolve on the part of the American people to move out of China and move production back to the United States. Already, we see Japan is paying companies, offering money to companies to move their supply chains out of China. The United States should be doing something like that. Western Europe should be doing something like that. Very interesting, there was a paper that came out of Brussels in the early days of the pandemic, before the pandemic was really, before it was dominating the narrative, before it was dominating consciousness, and this paper was not written with the pandemic in mind. So it's a pre-pandemic analysis. The people in Brussels were calling for greater economic sovereignty within the European Union. They never used the word China, but what they were saying is Europe, the European Union, Europe cannot be dependent on China for its manufactured goods. So, and now with Boris Johnson having been infected with the virus and thankfully having recovered, you now see in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom, there's high-level people saying, we have to reevaluate our relationship with China. And that whole deal of having China build the 5th-generation internet in China by Huawei, having the 5th-generation internet in Great Britain built by Huawei, that could well be scrapped.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. That was a lot of good information. Hope you're taking care of yourself.
I certainly am. Thank you. There is hope here. It's up to us to make the difference. And thank you for all you're doing.
And thank you for watching. You know, if you like the kind of content we bring you on China Uncensored, please consider supporting the show on patreon.com/China Uncensored. YouTube has been demonetizing a lot of our episodes, so we really couldn't afford to keep making this show without your support. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored.